Maid's daughter whispered about a hidden camera. The engagement ended instantly. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. At a lavish mansion perched atop a hill, the atmosphere was filled with luxury and expectation. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, and the soft melodies of a string quartet played in the background. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, murmured amongst themselves, waiting for the big moment. The billionaire, Charles Bennett, was about to propose to his longtime girlfriend, Victoria, in front of an elite crowd. Charles, a towering figure in the business world, had built an empire from the ground up. His reputation was as polished as his expensive suit, and he had always prided himself on his taste for perfection. As the night progressed, all eyes were on him and his stunning fiancée, Victoria. The couple was a symbol of wealth, success, and power. But little did they know, the evening would soon take an unexpected turn, one that no one could have predicted. At the far end of the room, in a quiet corner, stood Sarah, the maid's daughter. Sarah was only 12 years old, dressed in a plain black dress that contrasted sharply with the opulence of the room around her. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. Her job was simple: to serve the guests, keep the room tidy, and remain invisible. And for the most part, she had mastered that art. As she moved quietly across the ballroom, a tray of drinks in hand, she overheard hushed conversations, whispers about business deals, and snide remarks from the guests. But nothing stood out more than the conversation she had just stumbled upon. Victoria, standing by Charles, was laughing with her friends, oblivious to the quiet girl nearby. One of the guests, a business associate of Charles, was casually mentioning the latest surveillance technology he had installed in the mansion. Sarah, who was passing by with her tray, overheard him mention something that caught her attention: a hidden camera, tucked away in the chandelier, watching everything in the room. Sarah froze for a moment, her heart racing. She had heard rumors about Charles before, how he liked to keep a close eye on everything and everyone in his life. But this was different. This wasn't just about security. This was about control. She knew that if she didn't act, no one would ever know the truth. Sarah quickly gathered her courage and approached the nearest guest, a well-dressed woman sipping champagne. She leaned in, whispering as quietly as she could, "There's a hidden camera in the chandelier. It's been recording everything." The woman, shocked, glanced up at the chandelier, her face pale. Before she could respond, Sarah hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. What followed was a series of whispers and gasps. The mood in the room shifted instantly, as people began to question the intentions behind Charles's actions. His reputation, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny. Charles and Victoria, unaware of the chaos unfolding around them, continued to smile for the cameras. But as the whispers grew louder, it was clear that the engagement, the perfect moment, was slipping away. The guests who had once praised Charles's success now looked at him with suspicion, and within minutes, the engagement ended, not with a grand declaration of love, but with the sudden realization that the truth had come to light. Charles's empire of control, built on secrets and surveillance, had crumbled in an instant. The hidden camera, which had once symbolized his power, had now become the tool that destroyed it all. The evening was supposed to be a celebration, but instead, it turned into a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy and the price of control. As Sarah quietly left the room, her heart still pounding in her chest, she knew that her simple whisper had changed everything. In a world built on appearances, it only took a moment of truth to unravel it all. Murmurs filled the air, and the elegant ballroom that had once been the perfect backdrop for a grand engagement now felt like a ticking time bomb. Sarah stood off to the side, her heart racing, as she watched the chaos unfold around her. The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the guests, until it reached the couple at the center of it all, Charles and Victoria. Victoria, with her perfectly styled hair and flawless smile, stood frozen in place. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, unsure of what was happening. Charles, on the other hand, stood tall and confident, at least on the surface. His reputation had been built on strength, control, and success. But now, in the midst of the whispers and suspicious glances, his facade began to crack. His grip on Victoria's hand tightened as he glanced around, trying to gauge the mood of the room. The perfect evening, his perfect proposal, was slipping through his fingers. Victoria turned to him, her voice low and shaky. "What's going on, Charles?" The question hung in the air, but he didn't have an answer. He had always been the one in control, always the one who had the power. But now he was losing it all. The tension in the room thickened as some guests began to gather in groups, their murmurs growing louder and more pointed. It wasn't just the camera that had caused the stir. It was the revelation that Charles, the man who had carefully crafted his empire, had used surveillance to control those around him. The very people who once admired him now looked at him with suspicion, disgust, and doubt. It was as if the truth had finally been exposed, and the lies he had built his world on were crumbling right before his eyes. Sarah watched, hidden in the corner, as the storm that had started with her whisper slowly spiraled out of control. She felt a pang of guilt, but it quickly disappeared as she saw the devastation unfold. Charles, once so sure of himself, was now a shadow of the man he had been moments ago, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He turned to Victoria, his voice cold and controlled. "This isn't what it looks like." But the words rang hollow. Victoria's eyes, once filled with admiration, now held only confusion and disbelief. "Charles, how could you?" she whispered, shaking her head. The guests continued to watch, some with pity, others with judgment. The engagement that was supposed to be a celebration of love and success had become a spectacle of humiliation. The room had turned into a battleground, and Charles was losing. For the first time, he realized that his wealth, his power, and his reputation meant nothing in the face of the truth. The very thing he had feared most had come to pass. The world had seen him for who he truly was. The hidden camera, once a symbol of his control, had become his undoing. And as the whispers turned to gasps and the guests slowly began to leave, it became clear that the perfect engagement, the life he had so carefully built, was now in ruins. Victoria stood there, her expression unreadable. "I can't do this," she said softly, her voice breaking. She turned and walked away, leaving Charles standing alone in the midst of the broken pieces of his empire. Sarah watched it all unfold, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had set in motion. She had never intended for things to go this far, but now, as the reality of the situation set in, she knew that the truth had a way of exposing even the most carefully constructed facades. The engagement had ended instantly, but the aftermath would be far more devastating. Charles would never be the same, and neither would anyone else who had witnessed the unraveling of his empire. The aftermath of the engagement debacle lingered in the air, thick with tension and disbelief. Charles Bennett stood alone, his face flushed with humiliation as the guests began to leave the grand ballroom one by one, some with sympathetic looks, others with quiet judgment. Victoria, once by his side as the woman of his dreams, was now a distant memory, walking away with her heart shattered. Charles tried to salvage what little pride he had left, but it was clear the damage was done. His empire, built on control and secrets, had crumbled in an instant. Outside, the night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat building in Charles's chest. He stood by the large windows of the mansion, staring out at the city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled like stars in the distance, but to him, they felt empty, mocking his fall from grace. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, trying to calm himself. How had it all gone so wrong? The words Sarah had whispered echoed in his mind. The hidden camera, the betrayal, the truth being exposed in front of everyone. It was a nightmare that he couldn't escape. For a moment, he considered leaving everything behind, abandoning the mansion and the life he had carefully crafted. But he knew he couldn't. His name, his reputation, his fortune, these things meant everything to him. He had spent his entire life building them, and now, it seemed, they were slipping away. Meanwhile, Sarah, the maid's daughter, walked away from the mansion quietly, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She hadn't meant for things to escalate this way. All she had wanted was for people to know the truth. She had overheard the conversation about the hidden camera and felt the weight of the secret. It gnawed at her, And when she realized the truth about Charles, she knew she couldn't stay silent. The revelation had been a simple one, but the impact was far-reaching. The billionaire's world, built on lies and surveillance, was now exposed for what it truly was. Sarah didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to feel victorious, like she had done something important. But another part of her felt guilty, as if she had caused irreparable harm. As she walked through the gates of the mansion, she saw a taxi waiting for her, the driver standing outside, looking up at the grand house. He gave her a nod of recognition, but she barely noticed him. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She had heard the way the guests had talked about Charles, how they had once admired him, but now saw him for what he truly was. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Sarah had changed everything with just a few words, but the price of that change was something she didn't know how to measure. Back inside the mansion, Charles was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He turned away from the window, looking at the reflection in the glass. The man who had once been admired, respected, even feared, was now a broken figure, his empire in ruins. He was alone, and he had no one to blame but himself. He had allowed his need for control to dictate his life, and now, that very control had betrayed him. As the evening wore on, the last of the guests departed, leaving only the echoes of their departure behind. The grand ballroom, once a place of celebration, now stood silent, a reminder of how quickly everything could unravel. Charles sank into one of the chairs, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. There was no more grandeur, no more applause, no more admiration. Only the painful realization that his empire had been built on a lie, and that lie had finally come to light. Days passed since the disastrous engagement party, and the weight of the fallout continued to hang heavily over Charles Bennett. The mansion, once full of guests and laughter, now felt eerily quiet, as if it too was mourning the loss of the grandeur that had once defined it. Charles had not left the estate since the night everything had unraveled. His once impeccable image, now shattered, had become the subject of ridicule. He had been the epitome of success, a man who had everything. Yet now he found himself alone and questioning the life he had built. His fortune, his power, his reputation, they all felt meaningless in the wake of his exposed secrets. He sat in the same chair where he had collapsed the night of the event, staring out at the city below, the lights still twinkling, but now devoid of the sense of triumph they once symbolized. He had no one left to turn to. The guests who had once admired him were now gone, their loyalty shattered by the discovery of his deceit. Victoria, the woman he had thought would stand by him, was long gone, her heart broken by the betrayal of the man she had once believed in. His empire, which had been built on control and manipulation, had been revealed to the world for what it truly was, a house of cards. The phone on the table next to him buzzed, a reminder of the world he had tried to keep at arm's length. It was his lawyer, Marcus, asking for a meeting. Charles hesitated, then picked up the phone. "Marcus," he said, his voice sounding tired, almost defeated. "What's the point?" "Charles, I know this is hard, but you can't let this break you. We still have options," Marcus replied, trying to sound reassuring. "You've built a business empire, and you can rebuild your life from this. But you need to act fast." Charles leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes for a moment. "Rebuild? What's left to rebuild? Everyone knows the truth now. I've lost everything." "Not everything," Marcus said firmly. "You're still Charles Bennett, and you still have resources. The public's attention may shift eventually, but you have to take control of the narrative. If you just sit back and wallow in regret, you'll lose even more." Charles sat up, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want me to do, Marcus?" "I think it's time to take a step back from the public eye. Leave the mansion, go somewhere remote, and let things cool down for a while. Let the media forget, then make a comeback with a new approach." Charles wasn't sure if he believed in comebacks anymore. But deep down, he knew Marcus was right. He couldn't keep hiding from the truth forever. He needed to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be now. The man who had built everything on control, or someone who would face the consequences of his actions and make things right. He looked out the window, seeing the city once again, but this time with a different perspective. Perhaps it was time for him to truly step away from the life he had created and rebuild from the ground up. Across town, Sarah, the maid's daughter, was also reflecting on the events that had transpired. She had never intended for everything to spiral out of control. When she had whispered about the hidden camera, She hadn't imagined the magnitude of what would follow. She had only wanted the truth to be known. But now, as she walked through the streets, she felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was proud of herself for speaking up and exposing the truth. But on the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had destroyed something. She hadn't expected Charles's downfall to be so swift, nor had she imagined how it would affect the people around him. As she passed by a park, she saw a group of children playing, their laughter filling the air. It reminded her of the innocence she had once held, before life had become so complicated. Sarah paused for a moment, watching the children, and then continued on her way. She didn't have the answers to all the questions swirling in her mind, but she knew one thing for sure. Things had changed, and there was no going back. Both Charles and Sarah had been part of a world built on lies, but now they each had the opportunity to shape their own futures. The question was, would they choose redemption, or would they let the weight of their actions define them forever? Weeks passed since the chaos of the engagement party, and Charles Bennett's life had transformed into a quiet shadow of what it once was. His mansion, now empty of guests and laughter, stood silent. The media had moved on to the next scandal, but the stain of his betrayal lingered in his mind. Charles had retreated from the public eye, staying hidden in his private office, working on a few smaller projects, but mostly avoiding any spotlight. He had once believed that power could solve anything, but now he realized it had only built walls around him. His empire was no longer something he could control with just his wealth and influence. The constant need for dominance, the need to control every aspect of his life, had cost him everything he once held dear. His thoughts constantly returned to Sarah, the maid's daughter who had exposed the truth. She had been nothing more than a child, yet she had done something Charles hadn't been able to. She had found the courage to speak out when the world around her seemed to thrive on silence and deceit. He couldn't help but admire her, though part of him still felt the sting of his humiliation. He had been the one in power, and now he was humbled by a child who had seen the truth, spoken it, and changed everything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Charles decided it was time to take a step toward redemption. He wasn't sure what that path would look like, but he knew he couldn't keep hiding behind the walls of his mansion forever. He needed to find a way to make amends, to right the wrongs he had committed. But first, he knew he had to confront the person who had set everything in motion. Charles picked up the phone, dialing the number he had been avoiding for weeks. It rang once, twice, and then a soft voice answered. Hello. It was Sarah's mother, Abigail, who had worked in the mansion for years. Charles cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. Abigail, this is Charles Bennett. I'd like to speak with Sarah. There was a brief silence before Abigail responded, her voice cautious. Mr. Bennett, I wasn't sure if you would ever call. I understand if you're hesitant, Charles said, his voice more humble than it had ever been. But I need to talk to Sarah. Please. After a long pause, Abigail agreed, and within moments, Sarah came on the line. Hello, Mr. Bennett, she said, her voice steady, though Charles could sense the wariness in her tone. Sarah, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything that happened. Charles began, his words coming slowly. I've spent so much of my life trying to control things, trying to build an empire, but I lost sight of what really matters. I was wrong, and I want to make things right. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Charles thought she might hang up. But then, Sarah spoke. You know, Mr. Bennett, she said softly, I didn't do what I did for an apology. I just wanted the truth to come out. I didn't expect you to be sorry, but I do believe you have the chance to do better. Charles's chest tightened at her words. Sarah was right. It wasn't about a simple apology. It was about change, and that change would have to come from within him. He wasn't sure how he would make amends, but he knew this was the first step. Thank you, Sarah, he said quietly. I'll do better. I promise you that. As he hung up the phone, Charles sat in the quiet of his office, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was a path he had to walk. The road to redemption was long, and the mistakes of his past would never be forgotten, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could begin again. Meanwhile, Sarah, sitting in her modest home with her mother, put down the phone, her thoughts mixed with a sense of relief and uncertainty. She had spoken the truth, and now, the world seemed to be waiting for something more. She wasn't sure what that would look like, but she knew she had done what she could. And now, it was up to Charles to do the same. Charles spent the next few weeks in a state of deep reflection, far removed from the life he once knew. The mansion, though still vast and filled with luxury, felt like a cage now, one he had built himself. His empire, once a symbol of success, now seemed hollow, a monument to control and manipulation. Every morning, he would wake up with the same heavy feeling, the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. He had apologized to Sarah, but that felt like only the beginning of a much longer journey. He knew that apologizing was easy, but real change that would affect not just his life, but also the lives of others, would be far more difficult. One day, as Charles sat in his office looking over old reports, his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer, Marcus. "We need to talk. The press has caught wind of your attempts at redemption. The narrative is changing, but we need to control the story." Charles stared at the message for a moment. The idea of facing the public again felt daunting. He had spent so many years controlling the narrative, shaping his image to fit the world's expectations of him. But now, he understood that it wasn't about control. It was about honesty. Taking a deep breath, he replied to Marcus, "I'm ready to do this. Let's meet." Later that day, Charles and Marcus sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, far from the eyes of the media. Marcus looked at Charles, his face serious. "Charles, you know the stakes are high. If you want to regain any credibility, you have to show people you're not just apologizing. You have to prove it through your actions." Charles nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He had already lost everything he thought mattered. Now, he was left with a choice: continue hiding, or face the world with vulnerability and transparency. "I'm done running," Charles said, his voice steady. "I want to give back. I want to make things right. What do I need to do?" Marcus leaned in, his tone soft but firm. "First, you need to make a public statement. No more secrets. No more lies. People need to see that you understand the consequences of your actions." Charles sat back, thinking about it. A public statement was the last thing he ever wanted to do, but deep down, he knew it was the only way to take control of his future. It wasn't about gaining the public's favor. It was about showing them that he was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, Charles stood in front of a camera, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his suit. The press had gathered, waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath before beginning. "For years, I've lived my life behind walls I built with my own hands. I thought I could control everything, that my wealth and power could protect me from the consequences of my actions. But I was wrong. I've hurt people, including those closest to me. And for that, I am truly sorry." His voice wavered for a moment, but he steadied himself. "I've spent so much time trying to be someone I thought the world wanted me to be. But now, I realize that the only way forward is to be honest, to face the truth, and to rebuild not just my reputation, but my life. It's going to take time, and I know I can't do it alone. But I am committed to making things right." The room was silent for a moment after he finished speaking, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Charles didn't know if the public would forgive him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. Meanwhile, Sarah, sitting in her room, watched the broadcast on her phone. She didn't expect to feel anything when she saw Charles speak, but as she listened to his words, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had never intended for things to spiral out of control, but now, seeing him take responsibility, she felt that maybe, just maybe, people could change. It wasn't about him regaining his power or his fortune, it was about him owning up to his mistakes. And that, she realized, was something even more important. His days in meetings, reaching out to those he had hurt, trying to rebuild bridges that he had burned over the years. It was a slow process, but one he was determined to follow through on. He knew that to prove his sincerity, his actions had to speak louder than words. His lawyer, Marcus, had suggested he focus on giving back to the community, on proving that he could be more than just a man of power and wealth. Charles, though hesitant at first, agreed. He decided to start by donating to causes that had been close to his heart, but that he had neglected in his pursuit of success. The first of these was a scholarship program for underprivileged students, something that he had promised to create years ago, but had never followed through on. Now, standing in front of the podium at the charity event where he would announce the scholarship, Charles felt a knot in his stomach. The crowd was small, mostly local community leaders, students, and their families, but it was still an audience. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. I know that words alone cannot fix the mistakes I've made, he began, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that surprised even him. But I can start by helping those who have been overlooked, those who are given no chances simply because of circumstances they cannot control. This scholarship is just the beginning of my commitment to change. As he spoke, Charles saw the faces of the students in the audience, young men and women who had been told their dreams were out of reach because of their background, their financial situation. Their eyes were filled with hope, the kind of hope he had long since lost. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of purpose. This wasn't about him. This was about giving back, about creating a future for others that he had never known. When the event ended, Charles was approached by a woman in her mid-30s, someone he recognized as a local school principal. She extended her hand with a smile. "Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Bennett. This will change lives," she said. Her words hit him harder than he expected. It was small, what he had done, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Charles continued to focus on his philanthropic efforts, but he also started to rebuild his personal relationships. He reached out to Victoria, though their conversations were still strained, and he made an effort to spend more time with his employees, those who had been loyal to him even when he had been less than kind. It wasn't easy. Some people remained skeptical of his intentions, others still distrusted him, but there was one thing that kept him going: the hope that his actions, over time, would prove his commitment to change. Meanwhile, Sarah, the maid's daughter, had begun to see the world in a different light. After hearing Charles's public apology and witnessing his attempts at redemption, she felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to remain indifferent. After all, her actions had exposed the truth, and now she was simply a bystander to the unfolding consequences. But another part of her felt something else: hope. Sarah had never expected Charles to change, let alone try to make amends for the damage he had caused. But now, as she watched his public efforts and saw the scholarships he had established, she wondered if redemption was possible, not just for Charles, but for everyone. Perhaps she had been right all along, that even the smallest voice, even the quietest action, could make a difference. As she walked home that evening, her thoughts were mixed, but she couldn't help but smile a little. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt that change was possible, both for herself and for the world around her. Months passed since Charles had begun his journey toward redemption, and though he was still far from the man he once was, he could feel the gradual shift in his heart and his life. The scholarship program had expanded, and he was now funding several other initiatives aimed at providing education and job training for marginalized communities. For the first time, Charles felt he was contributing to something meaningful. He wasn't just the billionaire anymore. He was now someone who had begun to rebuild his life through giving back. But the journey wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, and Charles often found himself falling back into the patterns of the man he had been, a man who valued control and success over everything else. He had to constantly remind himself that the true test of change was in his actions, not just his words. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing the latest reports, his phone rang. It was Victoria. Their relationship had been strained ever since the engagement fell apart, but Charles had hoped that time would heal their wounds. "Charles," she said, her voice a little hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I know you're trying. She paused, the words clearly difficult for her to say. "I'm not sure where we go from here." Charles sat up straighter, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to say. "Victoria," he said softly, his voice sincere, "I've hurt you. And I can't change that. I can't erase what I did, but I want to show you that I'm capable of more than the man you saw before." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Charles felt as if the weight of everything he had done was pressing on him once again. "I know," Victoria finally replied, her voice quiet. "I see the changes you're trying to make, but it's hard for me to trust again." Charles nodded to himself, understanding the depth of her pain. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or ever, but I'm not giving up on proving that I can be better." The conversation ended with no promises, no grand gestures. But Charles knew that it wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about earning back trust, piece by piece. Later that night, as Charles walked around his empty mansion, he thought back to the night of the engagement party, the moment everything fell apart. He had been a different man then, obsessed with control and power, unable to see the consequences of his actions. Now, standing in the same house, he understood the price of his ambition. It wasn't just his relationship with Victoria that had suffered, it was his very sense of self. But as he thought about Sarah, the maid's daughter, he realized that she had given him a gift. Her courage to speak the truth, to expose what others wanted to hide, had set him on a path he never imagined. He owed her more than just an apology. He owed her a change in the man he had been. The next day, Charles received a letter from Sarah. It wasn't a long letter, but it was enough to make his heart swell with gratitude. She had written about the impact his actions had made on her life, how she had been inspired to believe that people could change. "I never expected you to be the person you are now," she had written. "But I'm glad you are." The words hit Charles harder than any criticism or praise he had received. They were simple, but they were genuine. Sarah didn't need him to be perfect. She just needed him to be real. And for the first time, Charles felt that he was starting to be. As he put the letter down, he felt a new sense of purpose. His journey was far from over, and there would be many more challenges ahead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of them. He had come to terms with who he was, and more importantly, who he wanted to become. The next few months brought more small steps forward, meetings with old colleagues, more charitable contributions, and an increasing sense of peace with his past. He knew it wasn't about erasing his mistakes. It was about learning from them and using them as a foundation for a better future. As for Sarah, she had returned to her daily life, but she too had changed. She had started to believe that even the smallest voice, even the quietest action, could make a difference. She didn't know where her future would lead, but for the first time, she felt empowered to create it, just as Charles was creating his. The two of them, from very different worlds, had set in motion a change that neither had expected. And while they might never fully understand the impact they had on each other, they both knew one thing for certain. There was power in truth, in redemption, and in the courage to change. Months passed, and Charles Bennett found himself in a place he never thought he would be, at peace with his past and cautiously optimistic about the future. The road to redemption had been neither quick nor easy, but as he stood in front of his new initiative, a center for youth mentorship and education, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The small building, which was funded by his own personal fortune, stood as a symbol of his new path. It was a place where young people could come to learn, grow, and find opportunities, no matter their background. It wasn't about power or control anymore. It was about providing a chance for others to succeed, just as he had once been given a chance. As he cut the ribbon with the local mayor beside him, Charles felt a surge of pride, but it wasn't the same kind of pride he had felt in his former life. This was different. This was real. This was the result of action, not just words. Over the past few months, Charles had dedicated himself to making amends for the damage he had caused, and he knew this was just the beginning. The past still haunted him. There were people he could never truly make up for, and the consequences of his actions would follow him. But he had finally accepted that he couldn't undo everything. What he could do was move forward, and the best way to do that was by helping others. The center was a testament to that. But as the ceremony came to an end, and Charles stood talking with the guests, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Victoria. "I've been thinking," the message read. "I think I'm ready to talk more seriously about everything. We need to take things slow, but maybe there's a chance for us to rebuild." Charles smiled to himself. He knew their relationship could never go back to what it was, but the possibility of something new, something built on honesty, was a step forward. It was a chance at a fresh start. As he looked around the room, he realized something that surprised him. He was surrounded by people who genuinely respected him for who he was now, not for who he had been. His reputation was slowly being rebuilt, not because of his wealth or power, but because of his actions and his willingness to change. Later that evening, Charles sat down in his office, reflecting on how far he had come. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sarah. It was brief, but it was enough to stir something deep inside him. "Thank you for everything you've done," the message read. "I didn't expect this, but I'm proud of you." Charles sat back, his hand resting on the desk, his heart full. He had never imagined that a simple act of honesty could lead to such a profound change in his life. When he had first heard Sarah's whisper that night, he hadn't known that it would unravel everything. His empire, his relationships, his entire world. But now, looking at the life he was rebuilding, he understood the gift she had given him. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about truth and the strength that came with facing it, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, Charles took a walk through the streets near his new center. It was a quiet morning, and as he walked, he passed by a few people who nodded at him, some with recognition, others simply out of respect. He wasn't a billionaire in their eyes anymore. He was just another person trying to make a difference. And for the first time, that felt like enough. He had made mistakes, and he would continue to make them. But the difference now was that he was no longer running from them. He was facing them head-on, doing what he could to make amends and create something positive out of the ruins of his past. As he stood outside the center, looking up at the building he had helped create, Charles felt at peace. There was still work to be done, and he would always carry the weight of his past mistakes with him. But he was no longer defined by them. He was defined by the person he was becoming, and that, in the end, was all that truly mattered.